a great way to start. So I grew up, I've been Episcopalian all my life. I grew up at St. James Episcopal Church, Lafayette Square in Baltimore. And some years ago, after I was newly ordained, I was honored to be asked to be invited back to my home church to preach one Sunday. And I showed up as terrified as I could possibly be, because after all, these were the folks sitting in the pews who had taught me in Sunday school. What could I possibly have to say? Now, all went well, I think. Right up until after the sermon, we got to the announcements, and the rector said, "It's so good to have Father Little Charles back with us today." I was about as embarrassed as I could have been. I said, I think I can be one of those things or the other, but I don't know about both at the same time. I imagine that's how Jesus must have felt in our reading today. Somebody says, "Oh, Rabbi Little Yeshua, good to see you. Glad you're here." And he's like, "I'm trying to be an adult. Come on." It's a familiar feeling. I bet probably a lot of us have been in a position of trying to establish ourselves in a new way or in a new setting, and something just won't let you go. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe you've been in a position where you've had the blessing of helping to raise someone else up, to guide them into leadership, and yet it's so hard, maybe even your own kids, it's so hard to see them as grown-ups now. It's always hard. It's a natural feeling, a natural inclination that I think all of us run into at some point or another. The thing is, though, that when we do that, it's so hard because it doesn't allow God the space to move in the way that God's trying to move in each of us. I'll tell you my favorite thing about this passage that we read from, as I move this giant Bible down here. My favorite thing is that we're told in the scripture at the very end of that first paragraph that Jesus could do no deed of power except that he healed a few sick people on his way out of town. Except, that's an exception you could drive a Mack truck through. Right? I'm fascinated by that line because if you remember the gospel from last Sunday, which I'm sure that you all do, then you'll remember that we heard two stories of Jesus healing people. And by the way, this passage that we read today follows immediately from the passage that we heard last week, where Jesus, as we're told in great detail, first heals the woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years, and then he actually not just heals, but raises from the dead Jairus' daughter. Right? We're told that as great triumphs of Jesus' healing ministry. And then, just maybe a few verses later, we're told, oh yeah, and by the way, Jesus healed a few people, and that was all he could manage to do on his way out of town. Why? I've honestly been wondering and grappling with that all week, and I often think about it when this text comes up. And for the longest time, I thought that, well, maybe Mark was sort of channeling Jesus' frustration here. Maybe Mark is pointing out, well, it's like that feeling where, I'm sure you've had this at some point in your life, where maybe you've had a great day, everything's been going fine, everything's going according to plan, you think you did a great job, and then one person says one thing that gets you all out of sorts. Okay, no, it's just me. All right, good to know. I think we've all been there. So maybe I thought Mark was channeling that kind of frustration that Jesus might have felt. And then the more I've dug into this passage, I'm beginning to think that I think actually what's happening here is that Mark is pointing us to a contrast in the next in the very next paragraph that we actually get at the end of our reading here. I want you to notice this, right? Jesus, we're told in the beginning, right, can do no work of power except heal these few people. Now, what happens at the end of the next paragraph? We're told that when Jesus commissions and teaches his disciples and calls them not just to Jesus' own hometown of Nazareth, but calls them to go out all along the cities and countrysides and towns all around the region, that they don't just heal a few, but they heal many. The word many appears twice in that sentence. They expel many demons and heal many people along their way. Isn't that interesting? That change of pace, change of perspective, that when like Jesus, we find ourselves kind of confined in our little bubbles, in our, home spaces, what we can do seems to be, minimal. Even if it's amazing things like healing people, sometimes it just doesn't feel all that grand. And yet when Jesus calls us out of our little spaces, we are called to connect with, to heal, to bring new life, new love to not just a few, but many. But 3 years ago, as campuses were starting to come back after the worst of the COVID shutdowns, I decided at the beginning of that very first semester back on campus that I would try to do an in-person version of, frankly, a program that I tried that just didn't work when we were doing Zoom programs. And I thought that we would do a little program, a conversation series around the ideas of the Episcopal Church and around sort of progressive Christian ideas, particularly around relationships and sexuality on campus, right? Things that the young adults I work with, often talk about, right? And are often kind of intrigued to find out that who we are and our perspectives in our kind of branch of the Jesus movement, if you will. So I thought, all right, great idea, let's try this, right? And so we created this program, advertised it, I made a whole curriculum for the thing, set it all up, was ready and waiting in our room in the Religion Center at U of H, waiting for students to show up. And that first week, not a single soul showed up. And then the week after that, I can't remember if anybody showed up after that. And then a little later on, one person came. I don't think we ever had more than 2 people come to that discussion series all semester. And so the curriculum that I had made up meticulously pretty much went out the window. And when a few people would come, 1 or 2, we would start to talk about just whatever was going on with them. What was going on in their lives, in their families, how they were managing through that period that we were in, still in the relatively early part of COVID. Just getting to know them and who they are, and they got to know a little bit about who I am and who we are as a campus ministry. Never more than 3 of us all together in that room. And then of those that started coming, actually both of them ended up coming to Sunday worship, to our Sunday. We had Sunday evening worship programming at that time. And then of those, one of them I asked to be a part of our student leadership. And then before long, that student came to me and said, hey, Father Charles, do you think I could be confirmed? Now, I had to, that moment where you're like, all right, play it cool. But I'm telling you, in my head, I'm like, yes. Worked. I'm not going to embarrass that student, but that student happens to be AJ, who you heard from earlier today. I promised I checked. It was okay to tell you that story. Sometimes we get in our heads when things don't work the way that we think that they should. When those moments when it feels like you've done all that you could and nobody shows up. It's not catching on. Nobody's interested. It feels like you failed. You wonder, why am I even doing this in the first place? Is God even here? What's all this about? We get ourselves mired sometimes. If you're one who reads the statistics about the demographics of the Episcopal Church or of mainline Christianity, for example, it's easy to get down in the dumps and say, well, our churches are shrinking, nobody's interested in church anymore, young people don't want to go to church anymore, maybe we'll just pack it up and go home. It's easy to get ourselves in those kind of doom spirals, right? The prediction, that you look at the charts and it's not a great image. And then when we think about those lives who we encounter along the way, those people whom we've met along the way, even if we're not attracting crowds in the hundreds of thousands, those people we've connected with and impacted along the way, who in ways that we may not have even noticed, you sometimes find out months or years later, or sometimes you never even know that their lives were changed in the balance because you connected with them, because they met Jesus in you in some way that has stuck with them and prayerfully may stick with them forever, and that they may change some people along the way too. In those moments that like Jesus, we feel kind of dejected and rejected and lost. I'm so drawn to the way that Jesus changes not just perhaps his own, but his disciples' perspectives. He calls them out of their comfort zones. He calls them and draws them out of where they're sort of used to being. He draws himself and brings himself not just out of his hometown, but he calls his disciples to go out through all the regions and towns, the hills and valleys all throughout the region, and one at a time to share that love of God with the people around them. I'll tell you, I find that really, really fascinating that in that text that we heard in the second paragraph of our reading, that Jesus says to them, don't take anything more than you need, just carry a staff, no extra changes of clothes, no food, no money, no extra tunic, the absolute minimum. Just go out with what you happen to have. Why? Because it requires you to be dependent not just on one another, not just on the people that you meet, but to be utterly and entirely dependent on God, and dependent on God to show up in and with and through the people whom God planted you, among whom God has planted you. Some of you know our ministry is hosted at St. Luke Episcopal Church, right next to TSU, just across the street from UH. And some years ago, during the Christmas season, they had a creche out, like a lot of our churches have little Christmas creches out, right? And one Sunday, they noticed that the little baby Jesus had gone missing. Where'd baby Jesus go? Somebody asked, and nobody could quite figure it out. And so rather than purchase another little baby Jesus figurine, one of the vestry members at the time put a little note in the creche, and it said, "Jesus is out walking in the hood." It's a true story. But I think they were absolutely right. We like to think that Jesus is right here all the time. We come back in every Sunday morning and visit him, and then we go about our business, right? But Jesus, beloved, is out walking in the hood. We got to go meet Jesus out there. That's exactly what Jesus calls his disciples to do. And beloved, I'm crazy enough to believe that's exactly what Jesus calls us to do too. As I said, I've been Episcopalian all my life. And if I know anything, I know that we Episcopalians are fantastic hosts. We throw great parties. We make great cookies. I'm smelling them in the back. We love to host people. We love to open up our doors and invite the community in. But we're really bad guests. Can I say that? It's hard for us to get out of our doors, to get out of our space. After all, we build these beautiful, gorgeous, fantastic buildings that give us so much opportunity. And yet, it's so hard for us to be on somebody else's turf. But think about how many miracles Jesus performed in his own house. None. Jesus always did his work out in and around the community, most often in somebody else's house, or as you know, in the hills and fields and valleys. Think of all the times that Jesus was in someone's home and healed someone, or performed any of the great miracles. I bet if you think of almost any great miracle Jesus ever performed, a lot of them, at least about half of them, happened in a house that was somebody else's. And the disciples go and do likewise. They go and baptize whole families, communities in the homes of the people around whom they are planted. They go and stay with others, relying on others, dependent upon God to show up in others in their community. What if we were to go and do likewise? What if we were to lean heavily, fully, even more deeply into going out and spending our lives, not just as hosts, but as guests, meeting and serving Jesus in the places where God has planted us. One of the great things I love about campus ministry is that, well, I'm always a guest. We, as some of you know, we're blessed we have a little home, a little room in the Religion Center at U of H, but that's not ours. And everywhere else we meet is in somebody else's place. In another church, we go around and visit a different church every week. I get to be a guest with a different church every week, which I love. And every week, we meet in little spaces on campus. We connect with people in little places on campus. At every school where we meet, we show up and we connect with people on their terms, where they are. And I want you to know, if there's anything that I hear most from students, they say to me, they say we have folks from churches come all the time and say, come to our church is great, our service meets at such and such a time, and that's wonderful. But it's much more rare that religious communities come and actually want to connect with them on their terms, want to know who they are, how we can support and connect with and serve and care for them. I don't think that's just a church growth strategy. I think that's a gospel ministry. And I'm crazy enough to believe I think that's who God calls us to be out in this world. So my invitation to you is this. I probably have already been talking a little too long. My invitation to you is this. Meet God where God is, not just in your place, not just in this building, but try and figure out how you can connect with somebody, someplace, in a space that's not our own, in a space that's not your comfort zone, in a space, frankly, sometimes that makes you a little uncomfortable. And that's all right, because God's going to show up and be there too. And I guarantee you'll find yourself in connection, in a relationship with somebody who will probably change you and your spirituality and your faith. Connections will be made that will change this church and change this ministry and maybe just change somebody else's life too. And little by little, just like Jesus told us, when we go out and we depend on God to show up in the places where God has planted us, we change ourselves, we change our church, we change others, and believe it or not, we really do change the world. We've been doing it for 2,000 years, and I'm willing to bet we can keep on doing it. Amen.